Dear Eve, and welcome to Famine Voices 2023. My name is Eamon McKee and I'm Ireland's Ambassador to Canada. It's my honour and privilege to introduce the story of the Irish in New Brunswick in 1847. This is not a well-known story, though it deserves to be. Many of the ingredients are very familiar. The cruelty of the landlord system, engaged in the forced relocation of tenants in 1847 across the Atlantic, the journey of some 100,000 of those tenants on what became known as coffin ships across the Atlantic to Canada, the death of 20% of them, either en route or on arrival in Canada, but the survival of 80% of them, thanks to Canadian compassion. This compassion was extended to the Irish, who often were suffering from typhus, and sometimes it cost the lives of those Canadians. We owe them a debt of gratitude for that. This story is brought to us by Professor Mark McGowan, as well as local historians, but above all by the local Irish of New Brunswick. Over the generations, down to today, they've preserved that memory. They've preserved it by tending to the mass graves, building memorials, and telling this story. A story that, as you'll see, still has the power to shock and to move us. I want to thank everybody involved in this production, and I commend it to you as an important part of the story of the Irish in Canada. Guramagat.
I'm Mark McGowan of St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto, and I'm here in St. John, New Brunswick, here in the harbor of St. John, which in the 19th century was one of the busiest ports among the British North American colonies. It was also here that in 1847 that close to 16,000 Irish famine refugees landed with the intention of starting new lives, both here in British North America and in the United States. The island directly behind me is Partridge Island, and much like Grosse Île at Quebec, Partridge Island served as a quarantine island for the refugees coming in 1846, 47, and 48. It's only 24 acres, and if you can imagine that sometimes during the summer, with the flood of ships coming in, that close to 2,000 people would be on this 24-acre island. This was a station where people were triaged, the healthy were sent on to the port of St. John, where I'm standing now, and the rest were kept on the island in what we would consider to be, and what contemporaries consider to be, substandard conditions. Typhus spread rapidly on this island. The migrants couldn't all fit into the wooden buildings that were there, some of which were being hastily erected. Others slept in tents on the bare ground. And because this is a Bay of Fundy harbor, the winds are strong, and sometimes those tents would blow down as quickly as they were erected. Now, in terms of medical staff, there were two brothers, the Harding brothers, who staffed the medical facilities here. And for a very brief time, a 23-year-old doctor just recently returned from his training in Europe, a man by the name of James Patrick Collins, worked on the island. Unfortunately, Collins contracted typhus and died on the 2nd of July, 1847. There currently is a Celtic cross erected on the island to commemorate the 2,000 Irish who died and the 600 Irish who are buried there in 1847. And it's this cross, which was erected in 1927 on the exact anniversary of Collins's death, which is replicated by this smaller version here behind me. This cross was erected in 1967 because now the island is inaccessible to the public, and at least in this space in the harbor area, those from New Brunswick, those from beyond New Brunswick can gather and commemorate the sacrifice and service of those who valiantly served on Partridge Island during the Great Irish Famine.
Well, Partridge Island there was a quarantine station there on the island, and I think upwards of 2,000 people die on the island, and this is where Dr. Collins goes out to. But they were also, I don't want to give the impression that they weren't in the town as well. People were in the town and being looked after in the town as well, and they were of course sick and dying there too. But Partridge Island kind of became a symbol for St. John, and in some ways for the province as a whole. Well, the story of Dr. Collins to St. John, you know, it's really, again, textbook kind of self-sacrifice, you know. Even though when we were researching, and he has a young wife, you know, and is pregnant, and you know, he ends up dying. So you get this, you know, classic story of human tragedy. And I think he didn't stop going. That's the other thing. And the people of St. John, you know, when you consider, you know, 17,000 people coming in Black 47 to St. John alone, I mean, you know, 2,000 people die on Partridge Island.
Murphys came over just after the famine, and in 1850, and he would be my great-grandfather, Daniel Murphy. He actually spent time on Partridge Island. Now, my understanding, and Mary Lou again has done the research, my understanding is that they actually came on the Jeannie Johnston, which had the best record of any of the coffin ships. In fact, they say, you could maybe bear this up or not, but they say the Jeannie Johnston had no casualties in all of her many trips across. But I don't know if that's true or not, but it certainly was advertised in that way. But Jeannie Johnston, but he ended up spending a month on Partridge Island, being quarantined for typhus. So then he successfully recovered from that. He came here, and I think was quite, well, I was going to say a typical Irishman.
We have an island right here in the mouth of the St. John River known as Partridge Island. I made a trip out to the island one day with a couple of friends. It was a causeway of rock, and I believe that's probably still what is there. And I think a couple of people tried to organize a few boat tours out there, but they didn't want to open the island, so it became, I think, a garbage can for anybody visiting all day long and having no real care given to the island. But we certainly know of it, and we speak of it, and I think that it's always stood in my mind of what it was there for.
We had an occasion to go over to Partridge Island on a tour put on by the Irish Society, and at the time the island was basically abandoned. The Coast Guard station was gone. Lighthouse was still in operation, but there was enough of the wharf there that we could land on a boat and climb up the rungs of the ladder onto the wharf. Since that time, the access to the island has deteriorated considerably, and now the easiest way is Coast Guard helicopter over. The adventurous souls do try to go across in the breakwater, but it's a very rough, very hazardous crossing. There are remnants of the various graveyards still on the island. A lot of the structures are still there, but have deteriorated to the extent that it's a hazardous visit.
So the first time I went to Partridge Island was, I would say, 1976. Usually, my youth, every summer at least once, maybe a couple times, cross the breakwater. And the breakwater is not in substantially worse shape now than it was, but it is tricky. And people, people often they think they'll take it on. If you go at high tide, it's quite dangerous. But anyway, the first time I went over there, because at that time they still had a manned lighthouse, which they don't now, haven't had in years. So you would see them, nobody ever tried to stop you or get in your way or keep you from going into buildings or whatever, but you'd see people out mowing the lawns and maintaining, and then the lighthouse keeper and his family lived there. But always a great sense of history. And there are bunkers there from World War I that are still sunk in, obviously. At that time there were lots of, you could not see that many crosses because they'd have faded into the earth, but there were, at one time I think there were 3 cemeteries, if I'm not mistaken. There was a Catholic one and a Protestant one and a Jewish one. But it really a strong sense of history, like it's the most amazing thing. And I always think, I haven't been out there in a few years. I was out legitimately twice on these boat tours and so on, but that they could get so close to seeing where they were headed and not make it. Like it breaks my heart to think of, they're standing there, maybe standing, or they're in the throes of dying on the island, and right there was where they were going after coming all the way across. The famine paintings were commissioned by Hughie Fitzpatrick, who was a great Irish advocate for all of his life, just died a couple of years ago. He was, people refer to him as Leprechaun. Anyway, he was the owner and the manager of Fitzpatrick's funeral home, so he commissioned their creation. And the neat part is that in any of us in St. John who, families that have been around, you're bound to pick out a face or two that you think, boy, that looks like so-and-so. And like I remember specifically one grouping because I knew a lot of people in it. And it was just portraying them landing, really coming across the water and landing. So there's a lot of people and a lot of luggage and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so Ray Butler, a local St. John painter, artist of various nature, mostly known for his paintings, produced a series of images of the Irish immigration here. He used a lot of local faces and incorporated a lot of local faces into the historic paintings. I think you'd be hard pressed to find an Irish background family in St. John that doesn't have at least one Ray Butler painting of something in their home.
Fitzpatrick's funeral home commissioned Ray Butler to do a series of paintings illustrating the arrival of the famine victims and their treatment, and he even has one, of course, the interior of a ship, how they were jam-packed in like that. It is a third world, a developing world event, which is continuous. And so Butler decided to take everyday real St. John people, and he put them in these paintings.
One particularly notorious famine ship during the famine refugee crisis of 1847, it's the Aeolis. It actually sailed to New Brunswick twice in 1847. First in the spring, carrying assisted immigrants from Robert Gore Booth's estate in Sligo, where there were casualties, at least 35 casualties at sea and more in the quarantine station. But it sailed again with assisted migrants in the late sailing season of 1847. But these assisted migrants were not from the Gore Booth estate. They were from Lord Palmerston's estate in Sligo, which was close by. Not only did they sail late, they were poorly provisioned and landed in November at Partridge Island in St. John, New Brunswick, just as that quarantine station was pretty much wrapping up for the season. Moses Purley, the chief emigration agent for New Brunswick, was absolutely appalled by the state that he found these passengers in. Indeed, some had died at sea, about 9 had died at sea, others in the quarantine station, but it was the malnutrition, the lack of proper clothing particularly, and the nakedness of some of the passengers that absolutely appalled Moses Purley, and he recorded those sights in the local papers. New Brunswick civic officials were so angry about what Palmerston had done and the late arrival of these migrants that they threatened that they were going to send them back to Ireland and make Palmerston pay. Eventually, these migrants were treated and triaged through the system that had been set up in St. John, but there were many orphans as well that came as a result of this mistimed and an undersupplied group of famine refugees from Lord Palmerston's estate. I'm here in downtown St. John, in the center of the old city, close to the site of what was the Orphans Asylum. In 1847, with over 16,000 Irish famine refugees landing in the city, it's not surprising that given the high death rate, many children lost their parents or were half orphans, with one parent unable to take care of them. In the late summer of that season, a orphans asylum was established by the Civic Corporation, and it's estimated that close to 300 children were cared for at this asylum over the course of 1847 and 1848. They had a school teacher here who was not that much older than they were. There was medical care that was provided locally. At this orphans asylum, these children were educated, they were fed, but mostly they were placed. They were placed in the farms nearby in New Brunswick. They were placed in businesses within the city. They were also placed with professionals. But the paper trail of what happened to these children is very problematic. The 1851 census doesn't help us because many sections of that census are missing, and in those sections that are available, religion isn't listed. And religion is an important feature of the story of this orphans asylum because it was essentially run by a Protestant board of directors with one Catholic represented, and unlike colonies like Quebec, Montreal, and even Toronto, there was no sense of placing Catholic children with Catholic homes or Protestant children with Protestant homes. The presence of the Catholic Church in St. John was weak. There was very little infrastructure. It was a pioneer diocese. William Dollar did what he could, but most of these Catholic children were placed in Protestant homes, and to local Catholics to the detriment of their faith. one of the ships that arrived, the Eliza Liddell, arrived under unusual circumstances. It didn't arrive at St. John, which was the principal entrepot for famine refugees, or St. Andrews, or even at the Miramichi. It actually landed at Shippagan because the captain of the ship, Captain Clark, actually was preparing to load supplies there for a return trip to Ireland. What the people of Shippagan didn't know was that there were 128 passengers on board ship, and they actually had no facility whatsoever for these passengers to be disembarked or to be triaged or quarantined. The medical officer of health, who was responsible for the area, visited the ship and pretty much cleared these people for any health deficiencies. Unfortunately, knowing that typhus actually has an incubation period, these passengers began to show signs of ship's fever once they had actually disembarked the Eliza Liddell. And that's where tragedy begins, as not only do these people begin dying of fever, but it spreads as they spread out through the Shippagan area to places like Caracat and elsewhere. And so the Eliza Liddell, which landed in a place where it really shouldn't have landed with passengers, created a crisis that Captain Clark didn't have to account for because he had already left the area with his cargo going back in the opposite direction across the Atlantic. But it gives one a sense of the lack of responsibility sometimes of sea captains who were deployed by agents, in this particular case from Lord Palmerston's estate, to deliver tenants, assisted tenants, to the New World.
The background in Ireland is very shaky. The Boyles were from Lord Palmerston's estates. Lord Palmerston paid ostensibly for their passage to Canada in the Eliza Liddell. The boat left in early June of 1847, and John Boyle, his wife Nancy, who had been Nicholson, had 4 kids. One was 9, I think that was Martin. Dennis was 7. John and Dominic were about 3 or 4. So during the voyage, and this was part of the family, that the wife was buried at sea. First time I heard that when I was 10 or 12 years old. And 2 of the children. So mother, father, and 4 kids got on that boat. And when they arrived in Shippagan 55 days later, father and 2 of the kids got off the boat. So 2 very, very young children, 3 and 4 years old, and mother died on the voyage for sickness, for fever, for whatever, but they had died. So when they landed in Shippagan, they were somehow cared for, in their notes that there was relief operation there from Shippagan, which is a very small town now. It couldn't have been much then, probably limited supplies. So they eventually got enough together in strength that John Boyle, the father, and a friend or relative, we don't know who, walked to St. John carrying the boys on their shoulders. So once they arrived in St. John, Father John remarried, and it was a woman from Sligo who had gotten to St. John probably by similar circumstances. And that was Mary Hannigan. And they were married in St. Malachy's Chapel, which was the Catholic Church before the cathedral was built. I also got a picture, and that picture was the picture of Dennis Boyle, who was 7 years old on the Eliza Liddell, as an old man. And the picture is taken from another picture, and it was on the wall, and that was, in honor of the founder of that branch of the family. And it shows him clean shaven on the sides and a bushy beard on the bottom, and there's something in his hand, a newspaper or some kind of papers. And I think there was a love of learning. And back to the famine, some of the stories that I've picked up on my own, 1978 and 82 and so on, when I was just beginning my practice of law. one man in particular, I remember telling me that he thought that my grandfather was my grandfather's cousin, both with the same names. But the milk was always delivered on time. It was regular. And when this man's father was injured or got sick, was out of work for a year, he refused payment, and the milk came every day as if there was nothing had happened. And I'd like to think that that's maybe a lesson from the famine. The question I ask from modern day point of view, what did we learn from history? And I think the mini lesson was in that family. You have to look after the people that can't look after themselves. So that would be the grandson, I think, of the famine immigrant, John. But the lesson was we know what it's like to be without. Don't let anybody else be without, if you can help it. So I'm proud to think that these people gave back, my people gave back, and understood the lessons of the famine, if that's a proper phrase. So that 100 years later, in the 1940s, when he had died, he had left a legacy of looking after people that couldn't look after themselves.
I'm here in St. Andrews, New Brunswick, at the site of the commemoration to members of the Irish famine cohort who arrived here at St. Andrews, New Brunswick in 1848. And the interesting thing is that this was a well-organized, assisted migration scheme that originated in South Wicklow on the Coolotin estate that was owned by Lord Fitzwilliam, the fifth Lord Fitzwilliam. Reason why they land here, as opposed to St. John, which was the major entrepot for New Brunswick, was the simple fact that Lord Fitzwilliam had interest in a proposed railway that would link St. Andrews and this part of New Brunswick with Lower Canada and eventually Quebec. He had proposed with shareholders that he could supply 100 able-bodied men from his estate, assist them across the Atlantic with their families, and have them work on the railway here beginning in St. Andrews. And so in the spring of 1848, over 300 of his tenants were assisted on the ship Star, and that ship landed close to St. Andrews. Not in St. Andrews proper, but on a very small, hastily constructed quarantine island called Little Hardwood Island that would eventually become Hospital Island, a rather ominous name for a place that was only about 3 acres in size and with no water supply that could be discovered. And so those migrants landed at Hospital Island, where they were quarantined. Many of them died, which makes this memorial even more poignant. One of the sad things about this beyond the quarantine island is that once the healthy were landed in St. Andrews, they only briefly worked on this proposed railway. With the shifting of the American-New Brunswick border, it made the proposed railway obsolete. And so within a year, most of those workers were unemployed. Some went on to other parts of the colony, others moved on to the United States, but By the 1860s, still about 1 in 4 of those original migrants from Coolotten were living here in St. Andrews, and one wouldn't be surprised to find some of those descendants from faraway South Wicklow living here today. Behind me is a video discussing the Lushtok, which was a ship that sailed from Liverpool that was never intended with its Irish famine refugee passengers to even land in New Brunswick. But typhus fever broke out on board ship en route to Quebec, so much so that most of the crew members, including the captain, were sick. And they were refused entry at Sydney Harbour in Nova Scotia. They then came to the Miramichi in northeastern New Brunswick, where they landed at Middle Island, which is in the Miramichi River. Already 100 passengers had died, and the Middle Island quarantine station was not prepared in any way to deal with the volume of the hundreds of survivors who also had contracted typhus. A young man by the name of Dr. Vondy treated as many as he could, but he himself succumbed to ship's fever as well. In the end, the survivors, some went on to Quebec, less than 60, and the others moved into other parts of New Brunswick and eventually the United States. But here is a case in point of one of the many tragedies of disease, communicable disease on board ships that completely devastated many of those who were looking for a new life in North America.
Dr. Vondy, was in Middle Island, the Miramichi. He ends up, of course, dying. And the Lushtok, that ship came in with it lost 123 people at sea. They buried at sea. And he and the first mate, that's all of the crew that was left.
There was one ship headed for Quebec and ran into problems in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And because of that, it put into the Miramichi, and it was a coffin ship kind of thing, and that meant that the people were started off with hungry, thirsty too. You can't drink salt water, and so they went ashore, and they found out that the people there where they landed were for the most part Irish too. So, and I will add this too. A lot of the people in the Miramichi at that time, in fact, into my time, still spoke the Irish language. And so that it wasn't hard for them to receive a fairly decent welcome there.
There was something about Middle Island and the fact that Irish people lived there who were sick, and also the old hospital. There were times when I would go by the old hospital in Douglas Field and just think about the people that were sick there. Even though I didn't know their names, it kind of connected me. I think there are a lot of people on the Miramichi who don't know exactly where they came from, but they know that they're Irish and they celebrate it, and that's the way I felt about being there. Just that there's a beautiful Irish cross there now, an Irish stone monument, and there are always celebrations there. During the Irish festival, people gather. There are picnic tables, and we used to go and have a picnic there. And even now, in our 70s, My husband and I will go there and drive from Fredericton to Miramichi, have a picnic, visit with friends who live there, and it's a very special place.